When it came to console gaming in the early 90s, for most kids, it was all about Nintendo versus Sega, but in Japan, another great system was being celebrated. One that didn't just compete with giants, but in some cases beat them. A console so small it looked like a toy, yet powerful enough to embarrass both the NES and the Master System. A machine with an arcade quality reputation, a library stacked with shooters, action games and experimental oddities, and a CD add-on that arrived years before most players even understood why that mattered. In Japan, it wasn't an underdog, it was a success story, but outside of that bubble, it became something else entirely, misunderstood, badly marketed and written out of the history books despite hosting some of the best games of its generation. This is the story of the PC Engine, how it rose, how it fractured across regions, and how a console that once rivaled Nintendo on its home turf ended up as a niche obsession everywhere else, and more importantly, whether that reputation today is deserved or whether we've been sleeping on one of the most interesting systems of the era all along. I am Lady Arcade, and if you like gaming history, then hit that subscribe button. Today, let's talk about the greatness that was the PC Engine. Some consoles announce themselves loudly, demanding attention through marketing blitzes, mascots, and endless repetition, while others slip into the world almost unnoticed, finding their audience without ever fully explaining themselves to the wider public. The PC Engine belongs firmly to the second category, a machine whose significance was never universal, never evenly distributed, and never particularly easy to summarise, because its meaning changes entirely depending on where you happened to be standing when it arrived. In Japan, it was a genuine force, a console that challenged Nintendo at the height of the Famicom's dominance and carved out an identity strong enough to support years of hardware revisions, experimental add-ons, and a software library that still feels strikingly distinctive today. In North America, rebadged as the TurboGrafx 16, it was barely a footnote, a system many players never encountered at all, slipping out of shops with so little noise that its disappearance barely registered, and in Europe, the TurboGrafx barely existed. It was so obscure that it was something that you never really had the chance to consider in the first place. That contradiction isn't an accident, nor is it a failure of the hardware itself. It's the result of timing, culture, pricing, and expectations colliding in very different ways across three distinct markets, and it's precisely that tension between what the PC Engine was in Japan and what it became elsewhere that makes it such a compelling machine to revisit now. But to understand why those collisions happened in the first place, you have to step back to the moments before any of those regional outcomes were locked in. Before the PC Engine was a success, a failure, or a curiosity at all. To understand how the PC Engine came into being, it helps to return to Japan in the mid-1980s, a period when console gaming was not merely healthy but thriving, driven largely by Nintendo's Famicom, a system that had transformed home entertainment so completely that it reshaped the habits of players, developers, and retailers alike. By the middle of the decade, the Famicom was everywhere, its success so absolute that it created a sense of permanence, as though this particular way of making and selling games had solved the problem forever. Yet, behind the scenes, that success was already beginning to generate friction, particularly among developers who had mastered the hardware and were now finding themselves pushing hard against its limits. Memory constraints, sprite restrictions, and audio compromises demanded ever more elaborate workarounds. And while those limitations often produced ingenious solutions, they also fostered a growing sense that the platform was beginning to restrain the very creativity it had once set free. One of the companies feeling this tension most acutely was Hudson Soft, a developer deeply entwined with Nintendo's ecosystem and intimately familiar with both the strengths and frustrations of the Famicom. Hudson did not want to overthrow Nintendo or abandon the console market altogether, What they wanted was something subtler and, in many ways, more ambitious, a machine that preserved the immediacy and accessibility of cartridge-based gaming, while giving developers more room to experiment, greater visual freedom, and fewer compromises. This ambition led Hudson to design the HuCard, a slim credit card-sized cartridge format that promised faster loading, lower manufacturing costs, and more flexibility than the bulky ROM cartridges of the time. An innovative design that offered plenty of practical upsides. When Hudson presented the idea to Nintendo, however, they were met with a polite but firm refusal, which raises the question, why? Well, from Nintendo's perspective, the Famicom was selling extraordinarily well, and there was little incentive to complicate a system that already dominated the market. I guess it's like the old saying goes, why try to fix what isn't broken? But that doesn't mean that it was the end of Hudson's idea. Indeed, it was far from it. The rejection from Nintendo proved decisive because it pushed Hudson to look elsewhere for a partner willing to take the risk Nintendo would not. That partner was NEC, a company whose name carried enormous weight in Japan's personal computing industry, but very little recognition in the console space. NEC understood hardware, manufacturing, and scale in a way few companies could match, yet they lacked the software pedigree necessary to succeed in the games market on their own. Hudson, by contrast, understood games intimately but lacked the industrial muscle required to design, manufacture and distribute a new console independently. The PC Engine emerged from this partnership not as a radical attempt to reinvent gaming, but as a carefully judged response to a very specific moment. A console designed to feel familiar enough to attract existing players, while offering just enough technical advancement to entice developers who were beginning to feel constrained. In many ways, it was a lot like the Famicom, just even better. Technically, the PC Engine was an unusual machine, but that unusualness would follow it throughout its entire life. At its core was an 8-bit CPU, but one that ran at a far higher speed than any of its contemporaries, paired with custom graphics hardware capable of displaying far more colours and sprites than any other 8-bit console on the market. This hybrid approach gave the PC Engine a visual richness that often exceeded even that of the Sega Mega Drive in sprite-heavy scenarios, not just because of the sprite handling, but because of colour, with a far broader palette that allowed games to appear brighter, cleaner and less constrained than the darker, more limited on-screen colour ranges typical of early Mega Drive titles. At the same time, the PC Engine's architecture imposed its own limitations, most notably the presence of only a single background layer, which restricted certain kinds of scrolling effects and made some genres more difficult to realise elegantly. The result was a machine that excelled in very specific areas while struggling in others, a console whose strengths encouraged particular styles of game design rather than any kind of universal dominance. In Japan, that specificity worked decisively in the PC Engine's favour. Arcade conversions and shoot-em-ups, genres that thrived on sprite density, colour vibrancy and smooth animation, found a natural home on the hardware, and developers quickly learned how to play to its strengths rather than fight against its weaknesses. Games like R-Type demonstrated that the system could deliver experiences that felt remarkably close to their arcade counterparts, while original titles leaned into the machine's visual clarity and speed to create something that felt distinct rather than compromised. The PC Engine did not attempt to replace the Famicom outright. Instead, it positioned itself as a more advanced alternative for players who wanted something that felt sharper, richer and slightly more grown up, without abandoning the immediacy and accessibility that made console gaming appealing in the first place. Essentially, you could make a case that the PC Engine had a more hardcore audience in mind than the established competition. If the PC Engine's initial success in Japan was built on careful positioning and technical nuance, its move into CD-ROM gaming marked a far more audacious step. In 1988, NEC and Hudson released the CD-ROM add-on, making the PC Engine the first home console to support CD-based games. This was not a novelty or a side experiment, but a serious attempt to expand the scope of what console games could be, offering vastly increased storage capacity, higher quality audio, and the potential for voice acting and animated sequences. The execution, however, was far from elegant. The system relied on a complex arrangement of interface units, system cards, and memory limitations that made the setup expensive and confusing, even by the standards of the time. Yet, for Japanese players, many of whom were already accustomed to peripheral-heavy computer systems, the promise of what CD-ROM could offer outweighed the inconvenience of how it was delivered. That promise became tangible with releases like Ease Book 1 and 2, a title that demonstrated the expressive potential of CD-ROM technology in a way few console games had before. Fully voiced cutscenes, rich musical arrangements, and a sense of narrative scope that far exceeded cartridge-based RPGs gave players a glimpse of a future in which games could aspire to something closer to cinematic storytelling. In Japan, the PC Engine's CD library flourished, attracting developers eager to experiment with new forms of presentation, pacing, and atmosphere. The platform became a space for ambition, even if that ambition sometimes ran ahead of what the platform could actually comfortably support. In North America, the same innovation arrived under very different circumstances, and the results were predictably disastrous. By the time the TurboGrafx 16 and its CD add-on reached Western markets, they were competing not only with Sega's Genesis, but also with a growing skepticism towards expensive peripherals and fragmented hardware ecosystems. The pricing was high, the messaging unclear, and the benefits difficult to explain to an audience that had not yet fully embraced the console itself. Where Japanese players saw possibility, American consumers saw complication, and the TurboGrafx CD became another example of promising technology undermined by poor timing, poor communication, and a market that simply was not ready to be persuaded. The contrast between the PC Engine's fortunes in Japan and North America is stark enough to feel almost unreal. In Japan, the console launched early, built momentum, and enjoyed a period of genuine dominance, even outselling the Famicom for a time. Its compact design, diverse library, and willingness to experiment earned it a loyal audience and a lasting presence. In North America, the system was redesigned into the bulky TurboGrafx 16 in an attempt to appeal to the perceived Western tastes, delayed until it arrived too late to define the conversation, and saddled with expensive accessories that fragmented its appeal before it had even found its footing. Even basic features like multiplayer required additional purchases, with the system launching with a single controller port and relying on an external multi-tap for functionality that competitors treated as standard. And the choice of Keith Courage in Alpha Zones as the pack-in title did little to communicate what the platform was actually capable of when games like R-Type or the legendary Axe were available but hidden from view. The result was not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet disappearance, a console that simply never managed to embed itself in the public consciousness at all. Thus meaning that the TurboGrafx 16 is remembered as little more than a novel curiosity today. Despite this uneven history, the PC Engine software library remains one of the most distinctive of its era. Shoot-'em-ups formed the core of its identity, with titles like Blazing Lasers, Soldier Blade, Gate of Thunder, and Lords of Thunder showcasing the hardware at its very best, delivering fast, colourful, and technically impressive experiences that still feel remarkably sharp today. Action games and more experimental titles add further texture, while CD-based RPGs and adventure games reflect the platform's willingness to push narrative and presentation forward, even when the results were uneven or awkward. At the same time, the gaps in the library are impossible to ignore. Platformers never reached the cultural heights achieved on rival systems, beat-em-ups often felt compromised, and much of the console's most interesting software remained locked behind language barriers for decades. Any discussion of the PC Engine's software identity, however, also has to grapple with the strange role played by Bonk. Known in Japan as PC Engine, a character created quite explicitly to give the system a recognisable face in an era increasingly defined by mascots. Bonk was not a failure in any technical sense. The games were colourful, responsive, and often genuinely charming, and in Japan, he enjoyed a level of recognition that justified his status as a flagship character. Yet, bonk also illustrates the limits of the PC Engine's cultural reach, particularly in the West, where he never became a figure capable of anchoring a generation in the way Mario or Sonic did. His presence underscores an uncomfortable truth about the platform. It tried to participate with the mascot-driven console wars of the late 1980s and early 1990s, but it never quite found a symbol that could travel cleanly across borders. But let's be fair, a lot of the console's best games didn't even reach the West at all, such as this game, for example. Castlevania Rondo of Blood is a game that represents not only the peak of the PC Engine's CD-based ambitions, but one of the finest 2D action games of its era, regardless of platform. With its Red Book audio, animated cutscenes, branching level paths, and fluid, expressive design, Rondo of Blood demonstrated exactly what the CD-ROM format could offer when used with restraint and purpose. It also embodies the platform's greatest frustration outside Japan, that many of its most celebrated works remained inaccessible to the Western audiences for decades, locked behind language barriers and regional exclusivity. That a game of this quality could exist on the PC Engine and yet remain largely unknown in the markets where the system failed says as much about distribution and perception as it does about the hardware itself. As the industry moved on, the PC Engine gradually faded from view. There were, of course, late attempts to simplify and salvage the platform, most notably with the PC Engine Duo, which combined the console and CD hardware into a single unit and resolved many of the system's long-standing usability issues. Outside Japan, though, these efforts arrived too late, with too little momentum, becoming footnotes rather than turning points, symbols of a platform that had solved its problems only after the audience had already moved on. Hudson Soft's eventual absorption into Konami left much of its catalogue dormant, with few meaningful re-releases and little sustained effort to preserve or celebrate the platform's legacy. Unlike Nintendo or Sega, the PC Engine never enjoyed a prolonged revival that reintroduced its history to new audiences, and for many years experiencing the system properly required a willingness to navigate aging hardware, scarce accessories, and increasingly fragile CD drives, conditions that made nostalgia feel more like maintenance than pleasure. Only recently has that barrier begun to fall away. Modern FPGA consoles, flash cartridges and high-quality emulation have stripped out much of the friction that once surrounded the PC Engine, allowing players to access its library without the complications that defined its original lifespan. Region locks, failing components, and convoluted setups no longer dominate the experience, and for the first time, the PC Engine can be approached simply as a platform rather than as a project that demands patience before it offers enjoyment. So, is the PC Engine worth playing today? Well, the answer depends less on the console itself and more on what you're hoping to find in it. If you were drawn to arcade design, sprite-based action, and the moment when console gaming first began to stretch beyond the limits of cartridges, the PC Engine offers a wealth of experiences that remain compelling and, in some cases, genuinely unmatched. If, however, you are looking for a single console that defines an entire generation through mass appeal and universally recognised icons, then it may feel narrow or even faintly alienating. The PC Engine was never designed to conquer the world. It was designed to give developers room to breathe, to explore, and to experiment within a familiar framework, and it is only now, with the noise stripped away, that it finally feels comfortable being judged on those terms alone. In that sense, the PC Engine feels strangely at home in the present. Stripped of the expectations and market pressures that once shaped its reception, it stands as a reminder that innovation does not always announce itself loudly, and that some of the most interesting chapters in gaming history belong to machines that lived complicated, uneven lives. The PC Engine lived two lives, one triumphant and one almost entirely forgettable, and only now, with the distance of time and the clarity that hindsight affords, can we finally see it whole. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. And if you want to learn more about another underrated console, click my video on the Sega Saturn now.